What if a game designer were to develop a school's curriculum? Game designers are exceptionally good at not just keeping you entertained, but also teaching you how to play the game in the first place. So how do they do it? How do game designers analyze different learning curves, scaffold their information, and how do you learn a huge amount of information without making you feel like you've learned anything at all? And how much of this, if any, can be used by schools and educators to design learning experiences for their students? To answer these questions, my team scoured through some books, some journal articles, spoke to some experts, and also played a significant amount of video games themselves. And while my unpaid interns were busy doing all the work, I was busy designing my own learning experience, using the same principles game designers use to teach you how to play their games. All to see whether or not this could be applicable in a more traditional learning environment. So stick around to find out the results of that experiment and to see how game designers go about designing their own learning experiences. Now, I'm sure you'd be surprised to hear this, but I'm a bit of a gamer myself. And for a while, I've been hearing a lot about how difficult the Souls games are. For those of you uninitiated to this cultural artifact, the Souls games are a genre of games developed by this company here. And these games are notorious for punishing you for dying, extremely difficult boss fights, and very little leeway for error. Much like our internship program.
I'm so sorry.
So you may be asking yourself, Mr. Eden Learning, what does this have to do with education? Are you just trying to show off the fact that you defeated the Elden Lord in a mere 83 tries? Yes. Yes, I am. But I also wanted to answer the question, how is it that one of the most notoriously difficult games in video game history has a higher completion rate than your average econometrics class? How is it that 4 million people completed this game when the only way to complete this game is to get good? And how can I teach something as well as these game designers have ingrained in me the impulse to roll away when they sense danger? The first step to answering this question is getting a better understanding of what it is we actually learn when we play video games. When thinking about learning how to play games, we usually think of things like the controls or the mechanics. But in reality, we learn a lot more than that. To demonstrate this, have a friend describe a game they love to you. Or if you're like me and you don't have any friends, I've taken the liberty of asking our team of remaining interns to describe some of the games that they love.
Baldur's Gate is more of a role-playing, turn-based game.
Now your goals might be that you go to the second division, or your goals might be to win the Premier League. Whatever it is, that's your job.
As well as the general's own skill and strategy and command initiative. And also,
you'll notice that they say a lot more than click X to jump. And instead what you'll hear is a complex system of lore, mechanics, tactics, strategies, and the skills that they've developed, and how they all work synergistically together within the confines of the game. These are difficult to describe individually and can only really be understood as a whole. So how do game designers go about teaching you something this complex without making you feel like you've learned anything at all? Mr. James Paul G., the guy that wrote this book here, describes this as a form of literacy. He says players don't just learn how to play a game, but they learn how to be literate within the confines of the game's world and its genre. So you're not just learning how to jump, you're understanding what jumping means within the confines of the game. Jump on an enemy in Mario, and you'll kill it. Do the same in Call of Duty, and you'll experience what it's like to receive a stream of insults from a 12-year-old via voice chat. Similarly, there are symbols and behaviors that make sense to gamers within the gaming context. So, for example, seeing a waterfall might imply that there is a hidden treasure behind it, or having red appear around the screen implies that you're about to die. G explains that you learn this literacy not by explicitly being instructed, but rather by engaging in the world and seeing what happens afterwards. He says that video games are great examples of what learning can look like when it is powerful and effective and not passive and inert. And it is this active nature of games that makes them exceptional and motivating through contextualization. He further explains that if you try to describe any of these elements outside of its context, it doesn't quite work out well. This is why maths teachers use word problems. You need to describe abstract concepts in contexts that students understand. So, in order to learn how to play the game, you need to get people to play the game so that they learn how to play the game so that they can play the game. So how do you achieve this? Well, it's not by playing around, that's for sure. Who wrote this? Did you write this?
I'm sorry,
We broke this into two main methods games use to motivate their players. One is immersion, which is brought around through context, and the second is progression. Both of these factors are ways to motivate players. And it makes sense when we think of our original example, Elden Ring, which is both so difficult and yet so popular at the same time. But before I can get into how progression and immersion work in practice, I first need to get started on my own experiment. In a few days, I'm going to be giving a lesson to a group of individuals using the same principles that game designers use when teaching people how to play their games. But if I am to apply these principles to my own lesson, I first need to decide, what am I actually going to teach? I need something captivating, something accessible, something that plays well on YouTube, something innovative yet relatable, something informative but not overwhelming, something that sparks curiosity and keeps the viewer engaged, something that blends entertainment with education, and something that not only captures the moment but stands the test of time. Finally, I landed on it. AI art. But what do I know about AI art? To fix this, I need a training montage.
You'll never make it in the big leagues, kid.
AI art is created using algorithms and neural networks, often trained on large datasets of existing artworks.
I'll never make the playoffs at this point.
There are major ethical concerns about AI art due to its use of artists' work.
Some see
without
AI art as a frontier in creativity, blending technology and human ingenuity.
Prompt engineering.
You're a bum, Rock.
Critics argue that AI art lacks the soul and emotion. You gotta want it more than anything.
Prompt engineering.
When building a game tutorial, game designers first ask, what kind of game am I building? Specifically, what kind of experience do you want your players to get out of it? There are generally two answers to that question: progression and immersion, both of which we spoke about earlier. But let's unpack each of those a bit more. Take a look at Tetris. Fun game, been around for a while, still played to this day. But all you really need to do in Tetris is fit different shaped blocks together as effectively as you can, figuring out, often by instinct, what is a good move and what isn't. What motivates the player is progressing and getting a higher and higher score each time. This type of game provides you very little in terms of our definition of immersion. If you're having Tetris fantasies, for example, you're imagining yourself in a Tetris tournament, not necessarily in the Tetris world. Unless, of course, you're Flash Kids. Games like Tetris use clever mechanics and satisfying reward systems to continue to propel the player forward, towards learning and getting better. If you were to draw a parallel with education, you might consider some elements of mathematics as another example of this. Being able to solve progressively more difficult proofs and the satisfaction that comes with that can be a huge motivator for many students. Next, let's take a look at the game Firewatch. Firewatch is what we might refer to as a walking simulator. There's no progression exactly, but at the same time people would say that they have had deep and even addictive playtimes, where they just had to finish the game in one sitting. These games immerse you in their world. They draw you in with the narrative weight and through the world building. These games provide context for your world and motivate you through the desire to simply continue to learn and ask questions like, what's going to happen next? Where am I? What am I doing? Who am I? Why doesn't my cat love me? Who killed JFK? Why does my belly button have a...
An equivalent of such an immersive approach in education might resemble a literature class, where you are immersed in a novel, the intricacies of the characters' developments, the in and outs of the world building and so on, and you read on to know what happens next. However, immersion and progression aren't mutually exclusive. You can have games like Portal, which are beautiful and immersive experiences, but are also heavily built on progression. Even within academic disciplines, there is no mutual exclusivity. If you're teaching maths or physics, maybe have students design a catapult to lay siege to a medieval city. You can have them consider a wide variety of material, the distancing and positioning, and even the construction of the device itself. So where does AI fit on these dimensions? My extensive study of AI art tutorials have led me to find they are typically treated as a progressive experience. It's structured as a set of mechanics that get increasingly more complex as you progress through them. You learn things like prompting, negative prompting, seeds, and so on. However, I believe that there's something inherently immersive about art that we should try to capture here. So I want this experience to have an immersive quality as well. To do this, I will call my students to build and design a comic strip with AI art. This gives them the immersive experience of building a story and characters, while they are simultaneously presented with the difficult challenge of maintaining consistent characters and structuring the scenes behind their vision, which, for anyone who's played around with Midjourney, can prove deceptively difficult. Okay, so now that we know what our players will get out of learning AI art, we now want to know how we should dispense that information to them. To do this, we need to examine learning curves.
What first comes to mind for many when thinking about learning how to play games is tutorials. The first few slow moments at the beginning of a game, or that button in the menu page that you never actually click on. But as you've guessed from this video, the traditional tutorial isn't really where most of the learning happens. My indentured interns found this paper here that examined chess players and their learning curves. They found that playing games was nearly always what helped players improve, not learning or practice. And so you do most of your learning when you play the game, as you have to continuously learn and get better to continue to be motivated to play. So if we were to chart out their learning over time, that would be what we would call the learning curve. And what the learning curve looks like differs significantly based on the type of game we're playing. Let's start with a game like Portal. Portal starts by introducing you to a single mechanic, a one-sided portal gun. You solve a few puzzles using this mechanic, and then you're introduced to another one, the orange portal gun. Similarly, you have to solve more puzzles before you're introduced to another mechanic, such as lasers or velocity, and so on and so forth, making sure you master each mechanic before you move on to the next. Eventually, you'll be required to use all these different mechanics together to finish the game and eat some cake. Maybe. This type of learning curve is what our team calls a puzzle game. You're introduced to a new tool with each step, and you have a slow practice phase for each of these new tools. Contrast this with a strategy game like Total War, where they teach you all of the game's mechanics in the first couple of hours through a tutorial. You need to be able to master all of these mechanics before you can actually play the game. The difficulty lies not in understanding those mechanics, but in using those mechanics in different ways in different contexts as you play the game further. How might your opponent's choices affect yours? Would that same strategy work in a context with limited resources? You already have all of the pieces, it's how you choose to use them that changes. On the learning curve for strategy games, we see the steepest incline early on. Just as any game has a unique learning curve, so too do different subjects. Maths, for example, kind of works like a puzzle game. You get new tools which allow you to explore different problems. Of course, the learning curve isn't completely analogous. Most puzzle games are linear, moving from one puzzle to the next, whereas mathematics is often non-linear, no pun intended. The point isn't to find the perfect game equivalent. In fact, you might never find one. What learning curves can accomplish is outlining and pacing how players make progress in the game, and how that leads you to your end goal. Understanding the learning curve not only helps you pace your lessons, but it also helps you craft the entire experience so that it is more cohesive and synergistic. So what does this mean for my AI art lesson? Well, as I mentioned before, there are a number of different mechanics that our students need to master in order to be able to generate AI comics. We'll be using a tool called Dash2, which is a tool that enables users to create their own AI-generated comics. While playing around with this, I identified 4 key mechanics that our users need to learn in order to successfully generate their own comics. These can include things like prompting the AI to generate an image, changing color of part of the image, or having multiple characters inside a single panel. Now, theoretically, our learners should be able to do this using only these 4 mechanics. So I should be able to treat it a bit like a strategy game. I introduce them to the first few mechanics, and then they use them in different contexts until they've created their story. However, Dashtun offers so many other mechanics and tools that they can use in order to make their job easier. They could sketch it out. They could use a reference image. They could even piece together different images and have the AI smooth it over a bit like a puzzle. So how should we treat the mechanics like that? Should we treat it a bit like a puzzle game where we introduce one of the mechanics one at a time? If we did that, then we would have a huge amount of mechanics and not a lot of time to do it. Not all learners need to know all of the mechanics in order to generate the comic. So how do we tailor to that? How can we create a learning curve for learners that will ultimately be completing this task in completely different ways? Managing this is perhaps the trickiest part of any game designer or teacher's job. Personalization. Personalization is tough. Whether you are a game designer or a teacher, you're expected to get inside of your learner's head and understand what they're thinking and when. This is even harder when your kids are basically just speaking a completely different language. My students, for example, keep on saying things like ghosted or let him cook or what's that smell coming out of his bag? How do games apply personalized learning? There are a few ways that games do this, one of which is personalized prompting, only introducing prompts when and if the player needs them. But one of my favorite, and one of the tried and tested ways that games achieve this, is through the class system. Not all players need to be experts in every single element of the game. Similarly, not all students need to be expert in every single thing you're teaching them. As a matter of fact, they won't be. A class system allows you to divide the potential pathways a player might take in order to finish the game. Someone who plays a mage class, for example, might just shoot fireballs at every moving thing in the game, whereas a rogue class might just sneak around and avoid combat entirely. Personalized game design allows the player to choose what way they're going to complete the game. So I have a bit of an issue. I don't have enough time or friends to test things out before I run the experiment. And whenever I mention testing on any of my interns, they tend to run away. So I will be going into this experiment a little bit blind as to what their starting points are. However, I can still offer a certain amount of personalization through classes. Like I mentioned before, there are a number of different mechanics that our learners can use in order to generate their comic strip. They can focus on prompting the AI generator, they can sketch things out, or they can even use reference images. Early on in the lesson, I'm going to be giving the option of 3 different classes based on how they choose to approach generating the comic. There can either be the prompt engineer, the sketch artist, or the inspiration seeker. Depending on the class that they choose, they'll be receiving different advice and prompts from me to guide them through the process of generating the comic. All that's left is to pack up, travel to our venue, and run the experiment. As I ran the experiment, I wanted to follow some of the advice I've heard from game designers when designing game tutorials. The most important of which is try to be as invisible as possible. I wanted the learners to be immersed not in my mesmerizing eyes, but in the task in front of them. To do this, I did 3 things. I had them begin by writing their own short stories and sketching out what that premise would be. The focus, therefore, would be on bringing this comic strip to life rather than trying to learn a new software. Second, instead of info dumping, I withheld information until it was relevant to them, presenting them with prompt cards linking to short video tutorials when they needed to learn a new tool. Third, tried unsuccessfully to hide under the table when they were working. And our participants, what was their feedback like?
It's very cool that anyone pretty much can do this kind of stuff now. But I do feel like there's almost like a stamp that is hidden in there that it was assisted by ChatGPT or a similar kind of generative AI.
back in the day, it was a mechanical process of just improving your art skill. Now, when you draw a stickman and you give a prompt describing what the stickman is supposed to do, you get an entire sophisticated image in seconds. And for an artistic process, that's grand.
Most people, what they thought at the end, they weren't talking about the workshop, they were talking about their struggles with creating the story that they set out at the beginning. They really put a lot of thought into that story and they cared about getting it right. And it showed in how they were engaging with it. And the goal of the workshop was really to be invisible. Just as a tutorial in the game was invisible. So I'd consider that a success.
If you're interested in trying this out yourself, you can find a PDF guide on how to design your lesson like a game designer in the description below. And if you've ever wondered why schools still insist on using memorization as a form of learning, you can explore that more in that video here. This has been Abdullah from Eden Learning, and I hope you have a good day.